Hi everyone, I'm Nancy as the Chief Operating Officer of the National Film and Sound Archive of Australia. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land which I'm speaking to you all, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to extend the acknowledgement to all traditional custodians across the lands we occupy. I'm delighted to welcome you all to our second session of Digital Directions, DNA Storage, Science or Science Fiction. This topic is very near and dear to us at the NFSA. You might have seen how we celebrated the 20th anniversary of Cathy Freeman's Olympic gold on the sales of the Sydney Opera House. This event also marked the technological advancement you'll soon hear more about, the use of synthetic DNA as storage. So yes, before you dive into this science fiction turned reality, I'll remind you all to please take part in the session by adding your questions to the chat window. Thanks again for joining us for Digital Directions 2020 and enjoy.
Data storage in itself is, I think, the biggest challenge for an audiovisual archive. Managing all these data means that we need to have the right skills, the right equipment, but also a future vision about what a digital archive will be. And it's about managing data rather than physical objects. And one of the topics was about storage and future storage solutions. For example, storage on synthetic DNA.
We found out that both NFSA and IOC have the same innovative approach towards these issues. And with the Sydney 2000 Games anniversary coming up, we thought it would be a good occasion to start a project on data preservation.
We wanted to use the 400-meter race of Cathy Freeman. If we want to store something on DNA, we would like to use something that is the DNA of the country. This is part of the collective memory of Australia.
So of course, if we manage to save that file and to retrieve it, this will be a big success.
We will suddenly see a whole new reality when it comes to the management of collections, the management of data. A lot of things that we need to do in order to make our collections accessible, we can do.
Good afternoon. Welcome to session 2 of the Digital Directions virtual conference. The title of the session, as you've seen, is DNA Storage, Science or Science Fiction. I'm Bianca Nogrady. I'm a freelance science journalist and I'm speaking from Darug Gundungurra land in the Blue Mountains. So I would pay my respects to the custodians of this land and to its elders past and present. This question of storing information in synthetic DNA is no longer science fiction. It's very real and it has the potential to revolutionise how we store information. So I'm delighted to have the opportunity today to be joined by National Film and Sound Archive CEO Jan Muller, who can talk about this really extraordinary scientific development and what it means for archival and cultural institutions. We will have time for questions at the end. I gather there's been some issues with the chat box, but if you can either ask a question on Twitter using the hashtag Digital Directions, or there will be a link to both Facebook and Twitter at the top of your screen, so you can click on those. So Jan, to begin with, can you explain why data storage is such a challenge, not just for archival organisations like yours, but for humanity more generally?
Thanks, Bianca. Yeah, it is a big topic for all of us. In a world, in a 21st century world that's dominated by data and data creation, it means that a world that produces this year alone 47 zettabytes of data, which means a huge amount of data. The world produces more data than it can store. And for an heritage institution like the NFSA, that's crucial. If we can't keep our data safe for future purposes, for future generations, we might lose parts of our collective memories, because that's what we safeguard. So we've been looking into ways to deal with data storage, data solutions. And obviously, bioscience could help to provide a solution, and that's synthetic DNA.
Yeah. So in terms of I guess the particular challenges with storing data, I guess it's not just that you have to be able to store it, but it has to be able to endure, and it has to be able to be read at the other end. It's one thing to store it, it's another thing to then access it. So when did you first become aware of the idea of storing data in biological form, in DNA?
There were some tests already in the world. 5-6 years ago, bioscience organizations, companies like Twist Bioscience in San Francisco, one of our partners, experimented with it already. And it was picked up because we're all looking for that sort of solutions, obviously. We got in touch with these people. We saw them at conferences, and they presented their first outcomes of their previous pilots. They did some experiments with sound, with music, so they were able to store some documents, some photos on DNA already. A song, "Smoke on the Water," Deep Purple, was the first song ever that they stored on DNA. And then we thought it would be cool to do something with heritage video. So the first video ever stored on DNA, because we believed in the idea that DNA would provide that future storage solution. Then we met with people from the International Olympic Committee, the Olympic Foundation for Culture and Heritage, who are dealing with the same issues. These people producing a lot of broadcast material. For example, the next Olympic Games will be broadcasted in 8K, which is razor sharp. It contains a lot of data, and it means that they need to store this data as well in their digital storage, which means they're looking for that sort of solution as well. So we joined forces actually, and we thought, what if we would store that video of Kathy Freeman's Olympic race in 2000, the 400-meter race where she won the gold medal in 49.30 seconds. What if we would store that particular video on DNA and just see if we can write it, as you call it, so write it on DNA, store it on DNA, but also read it so that you can retrieve the data, because it doesn't make sense if you store data on a storage solution and you can't use it anymore. So there was the whole, that defined the pilot for us. The video of Kathy Freeman, Olympic heritage material, but certainly also Australian heritage material. It's the race that made the country celebrate, that joined the country actually, and in that way part of the collective memory of the country. And for us, if we would say let's say store something on DNA, we would rather store something that defines the DNA of this country, and this race obviously did. So that's how it started.
So talk us through how DNA storage works, because we're used to a world of ones and zeros, but now you're talking about a world of ATGCs, and how do you translate that information?
Yeah, so traditionally we store data on zeros and ones. That's the binary way to store data, zeros and ones in the digital form. So in a hard drive, for example, the zeros, they represent the parts that are not magnetized, and the ones, the parts that are magnetized. And that's how they store information on hard drives. DNA instead is made up of 4 components: adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. Also to refer to as A, T, S, and G. This means that we have now 4 distinct values instead of these 2, the zeros and the ones. Which also means that we have to rework our binary files. We need to translate them into these 4 letters. So instead of storing each 0, 1 individually, we store them in pairs of 2. So for example, 0, 1 is A, 0, 0 is T, and so on. So you can actually combine more data into these 4 letters, because you got more options to store data than just the zeros and the ones. That's the technical part of it. Then comes the bioscience part into the story, and that's where we call synthesis, where they create DNA, actually creating literally a DNA molecule put the information that is being synthesized from the zeros and the ones into the 4 letters A, T, S, and G, inject literally into that DNA molecule and store it. It's real DNA. The only difference is that it's not stored in a live cell. It's been done in a lab, and that's why it's called synthetic DNA, but the process is exactly the same as how normal DNA would work. So you got more options, means more density. It's totally stable. I got it here. This is the end result. This is the file in which we stored the video of that race. You see how small it is. But this size could contain easily all the digital files of both our archive and that of our partner, the IOC, easily, even more. So it's as dense as it can be.
That's extraordinary. So in that little vial are free-floating strands of DNA, the double helix that we've come to know.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, with a huge microscope, you could see what's inside. You can open it and read it. So this is just the vial that's been stored. You can put it on your shelf. You don't need to cool it, or as long as you don't overheat it or freeze it, it will be stable for hundreds of years, thousands of years even.
So what do we understand about the process of creating that DNA? I mean, I sort of imagine these little, adding a little, adenosine or a tyrosine or a guanine. Is it a kind of a printing process, or how is it grown?
It's grown in beads, in glass beads, and it's just like what you see in a laboratory. It's a sort of liquid that contains DNA. And that's exactly where the magic happens. This is bioscience. I'm obviously not a bioscientist, and this is patented knowledge. So that's where they create the DNA. More importantly, I think before you can retrieve the data, again, I think that's crucial from an archival perspective. Our archives here at the NFSA are so-called reuse archives. We need to reuse the data because everything we store in our archives should be able to be reused by the public, by researchers, by students, and so on. So if you look for a solution in terms of storage that can be reused, you better be able to read it as well. And that's a big topic for now. That's where the future needs to have an answer. You can read it. We read it. There are machines, sequencers they're called, and these machines read the data, can read the DNA in this little file, and translate it back into zeros and ones. So, let's say, to simplify it, in this little file are these 4 letters, A, T, S, and G, the DNA molecules. The sequencer, that big computer, actually there are only a few of them here in Australia and even in the world, they read the data, the A, T, S, and Gs, translate it into zeros and ones, which means it translated back into a digital file, which helps us to whatever we want to do. So if we want to project this film, this clip that's stored in this DNA file on the sails of the Opera House, what we did when we introduced the results of this pilot, it needs to be translated back to zeros and ones before you can use digital equipment. But the same for broadcasting that material or use it on social media. So you need to translate it back, and that's where the reading part comes in place. And that's where you need these sequencers for. And one of the sequencers here in the country is at the Queensland University of Technology, one of our partners. And it provides a way to retrieve the data that we store in these files.
So presumably that at the moment is perhaps a bit of a bottleneck. The challenge, as I understand, it takes a lot longer to read the file than it does to actually create the file. So is that really an area you see as being likely to advance quite rapidly as the technology becomes more available?
Yeah. So what we saw in this pilot, it was actually pretty straightforward. So we took that clip, 49.13 seconds, took a bit more at the beginning and a bit more at the end, but it was more or less that race. So let's say a minute of footage, a gigabyte of footage, something that fits easily in a small USB stick. We shrunk it because the more condensed the data that you use for that pilot to translate it into DNA, the better it is now at this moment. So we shrunk it, and via that process that I just tried to describe, stored it on DNA. And then when the reading part comes in place, you need these sequences and take it out. So this 49.30 seconds we were able to retrieve it again after that whole process, reading it via these sequences, and use it for publication, and in this case, projection on the Sydney Opera House cells.
So what do you see as being the biggest advantages of this method of storage compared to existing methods?
It's the density, most of all. Traditional storage solutions, even when they're still very often used and very viable and sustainable as well, it's still a physical carrier. We still store our data on physical carriers like digital tapes or optical discs. And even these sustainable ways to store data are not there forever, will not be there forever. So 30, 40, maximum 50 years, and then you lose these data as well. So the sustainability of DNA, which will last for thousands of years, the density, so in 1 gram of DNA you can store 250 petabyte of data, that's 250 million gigabytes, 250 million of these USB sticks. It's huge. So in 5 grams of DNA, which would easily fit in this file, 5 grams of DNA could, for example, hold the whole Facebook data center in the world.
Wow.
Or 8 million times the combined digital storage of the NFSA and the IOC, for example. So it's the density, the sustainability, but also the effects on so the carbon footprint, the effects on literally on the world it has in terms of you don't need big warehouses that needs electricity, cooling systems, because again it's just you can put the whole internet in a shoebox, put it on your shelf and keep it forever.
And hopefully don't lose it every time you move house. That would be unfortunate.
Exactly.
So in terms of then, you mentioned its longevity as a key factor, that it does last. I mean, DNA is a fairly fragile material. Is it something specific to this DNA, the way that it's constructed, that gives it that longevity, or is it really just that it can be stored in this little canister and that really protects it?
Yeah, it's not necessarily fragile, I think. Think of, you might have heard about that mummy they found in 1991, it was, I think, in the Alps, in the European Alps. They found this guy, Ötzi, they called him, Ötzi the Iceman, who died 5,000 years before, was covered with ice and preserved pretty well. They were even after 5,000 years, they were able to retrieve his DNA and found out that this guy was lactose intolerant and that he still had relatives living in Austria. So yeah, all these data are still preserved in that body, in that Iceman, in that mummy. So as long as they're human, as long as DNA is preserved in bodies, we can store it on DNA because we can read DNA as long as there are people. So I think that's why it's an interesting, sustainable way to store data.
Yeah. Is there any concern around sort of degradation of it, or I mean, we sort of always think about DNA mutations, and those obviously have fairly negative kind of consequences in some situations. But I guess those are the sort of errors that are introduced during the replication of DNA, which presumably wouldn't be an issue in this situation.
Exactly. So once stored on DNA, it's stable and you can keep it for thousands of years. If you don't touch it, so the tricky part is where you need to read it again. There's still, and that's one of the results of this pilot, one of the outcomes, there's still a margin, an error margin of about 1% per, let's say, per run, per case, which is huge in terms of, if you talk about zettabytes of data, 1% error mistakes in that is a lot. So that's one of the things that need to be brought back to preferably zero. Indeed, the time it takes to read, that's another topic. We need to improve on that. The costs, so storing 1 gigabyte of data, this one clip, in this file, in this canister, takes about, at this moment, about $20,000 just for one clip, which is, if you talk about a whole archive, is way too much, of course. Retrieving data will cost about $5,000 per run, but it's like every technology. As long as it will be scalable and grows, and we got more data available and more use of the systems, we will see that cost will go down as well. And the expectation is that in 3, 4, 5 years time maximum, this technology will at least provide a solution for, let's say, a backup system. So not saying that we need to retrieve the data, we just use it as a backup. So in worst case scenarios, you will need to retrieve the data if something happens with your original archives, but at least it provides a solution for a backup solution in 3 to 5 years time. In about 10 years time, we will probably be able to put a whole archive on it and be able to retrieve it against acceptable costs. And like every other technology that evolves, it's a matter of time before it will be a viable, commercially viable solution.
Yeah. So who else is working with synthetic DNA as a storage mechanism? You mentioned the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, has an interest in it. But I imagine there must be a lot of organisations around the world and companies that are keen on this. So where is it at globally?
It's a bit where we are now. We were the first in the world, so that means that this is sort of leading pilot in the field of video. Netflix, at more or less the same time, did something similar. Actually, they stored one of their series called Biohackers, about the theme of storing things on DNA or using DNA as well. Obviously, with a larger budget than we were able to use in this project, but that's another one. So a lot of tests around the world at the moment, and again, we need scalability in order to bring costs down and to create a more efficient way to store on DNA. One of the important outcomes of the pilot was that we know what we need to know for the future in terms of creating a viable solution, more viable solution, more cost-effective solution. One of the things we did was we developed, or we established an alliance around DNA data storage. So a number of universities, institutions, cultural institutions, archives are a member of that alliance in order to create new standards, because for an archive it's crucial that we know what sort of standards we're talking about. So what is the standard? There are many ways to store on DNA, not just on this file. You can use water, you can use silica. There are many ways to store. So what will be the standard for archives or for use in general? And not only the way we store it, but also the way we write it and the way we read it. So what will be the, let's say, the standardized process that we can replicate over and by other institutions? So that's one of the things we're working on. So in the coming years, we will work on standardizing this procedure, making sure that everyone used more or less the same way of reading, storing, and writing the data in order to create a viable process.
What are some of the things that you're considering in making a standardized form of this? What are some of the factors that are going to shape the ultimate, where you get to with that standardization?
It's costs mainly. It's about money. I think that's the most crucial factor, because as long as most of the cultural institutions are paid for with public money, not say the richest organizations in the world. So before this, and also given the volume of data, before this will be a viable solution, the cost will need to go down. So I think that's one of the biggest bottlenecks. As you said, the time it takes to read things versus the time to write things should be more balanced. But again, I think given the fact that more and more institutions are interested, more and more organizations and even media organizations work with this and see the potential, big organizations like NASA, for example, or governments in general, producing a lot of data might join us as well. American government already invested millions, a couple of hundreds of millions in this technology. So I think it's just a token, more or less, that it's providing a viable solution in the near future. People believe in it, governments believe in it, investors believe in it, and if that's happening, it's just the start of something that will provide a solution in the near future.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about the benefits of this and the advantages of this approach, and you've mentioned cost as being a disadvantage. What might be some of the other limitations to this? Are there forms that can't be, or things that can't be stored on it, or that shouldn't be stored on it? What are the limitations, I guess?
Yeah, what I think for now, one of the things we need to find out. So now we just talk about one video clip of 1 gigabyte that we shrunk. So that was, you would say, relatively easy, even when this took us 6 weeks, the whole process. It's a long time, given the fact that you want to store something immediately and be able to retrieve it immediately as well. So all these things will change. But having said that, the fact that we proved that it works is the first immense step. The next step, to answer your question, will be how about, well, a television series, or even more. Let's say our whole audio collection, or more of our video collection. So volume, I think that's the biggest question, the biggest trick for now. How to store more from a volume perspective rather than just one example of one video clip. But don't forget, it's still early days. I mean, 5-6 years ago, no one actually heard about this, and it's evolving. And
why has it only been in the last 5 years that this has emerged? I mean, obviously we've known about DNA for a long time. We've had, challenges with storing things for a long time. Was there particular technological developments that have enabled this to happen now, or is it really just it's time? The time is right that the storage question has become so acute that something else was needed.
I think it's more a fact that humanity was able to use biology in a technical way, and that's new. And that's pretty new. That creates so much more options in this case for us to develop a storage solution. There are many more things happening in that area. So I think the fact that biology can be used in developing technology is the biggest step, and that's young. That's a young industry.
Yeah. So I guess how this might be used. I mean, obviously, we're talking in the context of cultural institutions, media organisations, archival institutions. Do you see this as being, I guess, what we'd call the first line solution for storage in the future? Is this, or is it always going to be the backup? Is there the potential for this to be something where instead of me having however many external hard drives I have tucked in my desk drawer, that I could just have a neat little coder and sequencer that could do all of this? Is that in the future?
Yeah, well, it's a near future. It's not about creating a solution for a backup. It will be bigger than that. It will replace eventually the solutions that we have now. So all these big data warehouses with all these machines and computers, a lot of square meters, a lot of electricity, and so on. It will replace that system, and that might take 8 years, it might take 15 years, but certainly within that time frame, I think there will be a solution that will provide an archive that is stored on DNA, that is retrievable and reusable in the way we do it now. So it will replace the traditional digital storage solutions, and it's a matter of time.
I wonder about also biological storage, and I guess I'm thinking about the seed vault in in the Arctic Circle, where we have all of this biological information that is stored in biological form, but that's exquisitely vulnerable to temperature changes, and there's been so many concerns about it. It feels like this is something that could extend way beyond the storage of, I guess, human-created information to also store, ironically, biological information.
That's right. Now look at Ötzi the Iceman, the mummy. I mean, stored, well preserved, deep frozen, and still we were able to retrieve the data, the DNA data. There will be the same with this little file. You can store it in whatever condition and it remains stable. The only thing you need is a machine to read it. But again, as long as there's humans, they will be able to read it, because we need to be able to read our DNA as well. And it's not different from human DNA. It is human DNA produced in a synthetic way. So yeah, the stability, the sustainability, the long-term safety of it is essential for the success of this solution.
I wonder if there's a kind of, is it considered a biohazard that you have this essentially alien DNA or foreign DNA in the environment? But I guess that would have to be something that, I don't know how that would translate, but that feels like that's a science fiction movie in the making.
Well, science fiction, actually what we say is we took the fiction out of science fiction because it feels like science fiction. Actually, it is science fiction, literally. You might remember in, end of the 1970s, early 1980s, Earth sent this message into space. It was actually a plate, a copper plate, with an image of a man and a woman, a message, an encoded message for whatever extraterrestrial life they would find. Even music was encrypted in that plate. You could also send one of these files into space and see who picks it up, because humanity could be here. And that's an interesting observation, and that's the science fiction part of it. It feels like it's still not real, but it's happening.
Yeah. So obviously there's, as you said, this is very much at the start of this trajectory. So for the National Film and Sound Archive, you've now encoded this Cathy Freeman's extraordinary victory. You've encoded that. Do you have another video or another something that you're planning to do next?
Yeah, well, for us this was important because we wanted to show the world that it works, and we didn't know for ourselves if it would work, but that's what we proved. So we wanted to be the first that stored institution that stored a video on synthetic DNA that works. We can retrieve the data. I don't think the next step will be to store another clip on DNA. I think it's now important that we work on the standardization and that we work on solutions to bring the cost down, because that's where all institutions will profit. And do that in collaboration with other institutions, obviously, and universities, and again, companies like Twist Bioscience. It's about scalability. That at the end of the day, that's what we need in order to bring costs down and to make it more time efficient. So that will be our focus. So we will focus on the standards, on the costs, rather than storing more of our collection. Might be the next step, but then in terms of what I just described, in terms of volume. So before, for example, the audio collection or parts of our video collection.
Yeah. So I guess, what do you personally find most interesting about this process, this DNA storage? I mean, there's so much of it that is, so extraordinary. What really appeals to you personally about this? What captured your imagination?
Yeah, the size again. If you see, it's a grain of sand that contains a whole archive easily. So that's for me, that's still science fiction. What I like most myself was that we were in that process, we're able to retrieve the data again, because it feels like, okay, we've seen that you can store things on DNA, you can recreate DNA, but then being able to retrieve it from a file this size, the data in this file, to retrieve it and reuse it again. That's the magic for me, because that's what an archive is all about. We want to keep memories alive, and we can do that on these things. But more importantly, we want to be open. We want to be an archive that is usable and reusable, and that means that we need to be able to read the data as well. And creating DNA, translating zeros and ones into the 4 letters, A, T, S, and G, and then recreating it back into zeros and ones again in order to use it for projection or broadcast or whatever. That's for me, from a technical perspective. And then again, I'm not a bioscientist, so I'm focusing more on the binary technical part of it, that's where the magic for me as an archivist actually comes in, and that was the magic for me, really.
Yeah, there's an interesting question that's come up from Shane Brainard as well, which you mentioned that you're not a biological scientist, and he's sort of wondering about the changing skill set required for archivists of the future. If we do have this DNA data storage, that this might be a whole field of archival science, I guess.
Yeah, yes and no. I think at the end of the day, it's still about storing data, and it just replaces, not just because it is still magic, but it will replace the traditional LTO tapes, optical discs, the carriers that we use now. And it will still be a process of writing the data, storing it, and being able to retrieve and read it. That doesn't change. And I think that whole bioscience part will still be delivered by, it's probably more a matter of working with different partners than we're used to. That will change the workflow. Not necessarily the work of an archive or an archivist. It's still about, at the end of the day, storing it somewhere, in this case, synthetic DNA. At the same time, there are some ethical issues maybe, but also some archival issues that comes with, what if we will be able to store everything we produce as a country, as a society, as a world? The 47 zettabytes in 2020 will be probably 120 zettabytes in 10 years' time. But if this sort of solutions help us to store the data, which means that we won't lose data anymore, and that was the risk all the time, then suddenly there's this whole opportunity not making a decision about what to store anymore. Now we think about, if we talk about broadcast material, do we need to keep all the episodes of a series that's repeated every evening again? Probably not. But do we want to choose or not? This technology helps us to store everything we produce, so we don't have to choose anymore. And if there, at the other hand, is technology that helps us to create metadata, so define what's in the file, define what's in the archive, and we can automate that, then it means that we can store everything that's being produced, that we can describe it, and that we can read it, and it's just an automated process from start to end and retrieval. And that comes with some important questions for an archivist, because what's the role of an archive? Are we providing context, or are we just a deliverer of data, or the safekeeper of data? And I think that's maybe not an ethical, but at least it's an important question for an archive. What is the future for an archive? We say an archive should provide context, interpret things that happen in society, create an overview of the media history of a country. But what if we don't have to choose anymore, because we can store everything on DNA and we can take it out as soon as possible, and so on? That's an interesting one.
That's fascinating. Really does change the role. Instead of, I guess, being a curator of history, that you may be a categorizer of history, that the focus will be more on the taxonomy of that information rather than kind of the curation of the select pieces that we have the space to hold and to preserve.
Exactly.
Wow, that's a big question for the archival community.
Yeah.
It's not one that keeps you awake at night yet, though, I imagine.
No, but it's funny. Normally it's the other way around. You start with these sort of questions when you talk about the role of an archive, and now suddenly there is this technology that, again, will be a viable solution in a couple of years' time, that defines these sort of questions the other way around. It starts with technology, and suddenly technology is not a bottleneck anymore. And it used to be a bottleneck because we couldn't store all the data that we wanted to store, and the world is producing more data than it can store. And suddenly that's not the case anymore. So we're looping it back to other questions. What is the role for an archive?
So are you having those conversations with other cultural institutions and archivists?
Internally as well. We just spend.
Are those positive conversations?
Yeah, of course, because it's exciting, isn't it? If there's a technology that can help us to first of all to store what we need to store, the heritage of a country, the collective memory of a country, that's great news. That's perfect. And then from a future positioning perspective, what is the role for an archive? yeah, these are the interesting conversations. And we literally yesterday we had a day with our board and we talked about these things. Is it about context? Is it about content? Is it about preserving culture or all of that? And again, given the technology that we might develop together, for example, this DNA storage solution, it will change the role of an archive. And we need to be able to, what I always say, to remain relevant. An archive needs to be relevant. If we're not relevant, it doesn't make sense for us to be there anymore. And the almost ethical question for an archive is, would we make ourselves redundant if that whole process is automated from beginning to end, even including the metadata creation and the storage, an endless possibility of storing data? What's the role for that archive? And
interesting though, I remember going to the old museum in Cairo, sort of the Museum of Antiquities, I can't remember what it's called, when I was a child, and it was crammed full. There was so much stuff. There was statues leaning up against corners. It was overwhelming, and there was no kind of sense of curation to it. And I wonder if there is a risk, if we do have, for example, let's say we digitize every sculpture that's made, every piece of artwork, and so that we have all of that. I mean, people still want to see that stuff. They still want to enjoy that stuff. Yeah. So, that, I guess, as you're saying, that is the challenge. How do we not just read it, but how do we actually appreciate this, and how do we relate to this?
And that's one of the answers, or one of the topics around how to remain relevant. I think that storing heritage is one thing, sharing is another thing. People want to share, people want to experience. There's a reason that we developed and designed exhibitions here based on our collections, because we want to be able to share our material with other people. It's not a locked archive for the sake of archiving. We need to share it, and that's a way to remain relevant, to be able to share your collections. So that's the role for an archive, for sure. It can be it can be an exhibition. It can be something that you post on social media. It can be your website where you share your material with audiences or users. But at the end of the day, it's the combination of preserving and sharing. And whole cities have been digitized already. They use big scanners. The pyramids in Egypt, for example, have been scanned. There are 3D models, digital models of these pyramids. So that's no rocket science anymore. The question is, what do you do with it, and how will you reuse it, and in what sort of context? And again, there's a role for archives to provide context around digitized objects, whether that's a film or a television show or a radio show or a video game like we started recently, or a whole city. We can store it now. Look at DNA. That will help us to store all these data. And then the question is what to do with it. And that's where the role of an archive comes in, to help us to define how to provide context around all these digitized objects. And that's where the knowledge comes in as well. And that's part of that you can't automate, probably. It's where the human brain will still play a role.
There's some interesting questions coming on this. Someone has asked that this sounds like it was a very big bet for the National Film and Sound Archive to make. So how do you prioritize making these bets on the future, which I guess to some degree there is a gamble in this, versus your everyday strategic priorities?
This is part of our strategic priorities because it touches the sustainability of an archive. We need to know what's there in terms of our future. Because again, if we don't find the solutions, and it's also about money. I mean, we pay millions to store our data, and all these people that say, oh, you just put it in the cloud. Yeah, the cloud is also a bunch of computers. That's also still based on physical tapes and optical discs. So the cloud is still an object. It's not something magical. It's an object. It's physical. It will deteriorate. It will erase at a certain stage. So it is a strategic topic for us, And in terms of the money we spent on this pilot, we didn't spend money because we had our partners and sponsors in that. And even then, it would have been well spent because it taught us so much about future solutions and the way we want to direct ourselves. It's been worth it. So yes, it is a strategical topic, and yes, it's worth spending money on it. And I think, like in most cases when it comes to the development of this sort of technologies, we need to create a network of collecting institutions, universities that are focusing on these things together with us or within that alliance, for example. And that's where the strategic effects will find its place.
Yeah. You mentioned about the issues with kind of longevity of existing storage methods, and then that there is a 1%, I think you mentioned a 1% error
More or
rate
less,
in the,
yeah.
more or less. What does that error look like? What does, at the other end, is it just that you might have like a word wobble?
The fact that I've got blue eyes, that brown hair, and that I'm 6'7", it's all encoded in my DNA. And if you read my DNA, you will read the information that says that I got blue eyes, brown hair, and that I'm 6'7". If you read it in the wrong way and there's this 1% error margin, suddenly I might have brown eyes or blonde hair or shrunk to 1.50 meters, for example. So it means the DNA is altered, is changed, and it's not the original object anymore. And I think, again, from an archive perspective, that's crucial. You need to make sure, and that's part of the pilot actually, you need to make sure that what you put in the DNA is the same object, file, heritage material that you took out. Because if you change heritage, you change history. And in whatever way, every mistake that's made when you retrieve the data alters the object and alters, in a way, changes history. And that's an archive is there to safeguard the heritage, to safeguard the memories. You can't change it. So even if it's a 0.1% error margin, it's still too much. So that's one of the important things to work on.
Yeah. Somebody's asked about the Deadline 2025 project and has asked if you could tell us a little bit more about that and whether DNA storage might factor in that project down the line.
Yeah, certainly. That's certainly linked. Deadline 2025 is our magnetic tape digitization project. Deadline 2025 because we say if material magnetic tape and magnetic tape in our collection is not digitized before 2020-25, it's too late. We lose the knowledge to use the machines, we lose the machines to play the material, and we lose the magnetic carriers as well because it's deteriorating. So by 2025 we need to have digitized that part of our vulnerable heritage collections. Luckily we were funded by our Minister Fletcher, a couple of months ago in order to digitize our collections, our magnetic tape collection, which means that by digitizing that part of the collection, we create a lot of data as well. So that's why it's a linked topic. The fact that we create more data means that we have to look into digital storage solutions as well, and that's why it's even more crucial to know how these sort of potential solutions work for us.
Yeah, yeah. We've talked about kind of cultural archival organisations and media organisations. What other industries might benefit from this technology or be disrupted by this technology?
I think every industry that produces data, and we all produce data, so it's an endless stream of potential uses of this technology, I would say. Of course, the first organizations you think about are the companies that really produce a lot of, so NASA, for example, or big governments. But eventually, given the fact that it will become a viable, sustainable, long-term solution for any data creator, it will disrupt all industries, all providers of data, banks, insurance companies, you name it.
Yeah. Is the cost of the resequencing changing? You mentioned cost was as an issue, and I mean this project's now, I guess, nearly a year, I think, in its kind of progress. Has the cost changed just in that time?
Yeah.
What do you see as being the affordable level for this?
Well, think about what we pay now for digital storage and retrieving our data. Again, most of the archives are reuse archives. We are there for the sake of sharing the material, which means that you need to be able to retrieve it against realistic cost levels. Let's say we pay a couple of millions per year to store our data, say in a safe way, in a digital storage solution, and retrieve it as well. Given the fact that every run to read, so from this file again, to read the data on this one costs about $5,000. There will be 4,000 by the end of this year, and will be 1,000 by the end of next year. So that's how cost will decline in the short term. The same for the writing part of it. So what is acceptable? It is acceptable as long as it's not exceeding the cost that we pay now for our systems. And even better, and that will happen as well, it's a matter of time, less, of course, pay less to store and read it again. And that will come from savings on electricity already. We are all big users of electricity, so all these archives and their systems. So again, a matter of time. Before it's acceptable. Gartner, a big IT company, estimates that in 3 years' time from now, 30% of the big companies will at least have a DNA storage pilot running, just to see how it would influence their business. So it's
30%.
Becoming 30%.
That's huge.
Yeah.
I mean, so you've been really one of the first organisations in the world to do this with video. With this pilot, what do you think are the key lessons that you've learned, and what, I guess, advice or what can other organisations learn from your experiences to do better?
It taught us how to collaborate with bioscience organisations and think about biotechnical solutions, which is a way of thinking that is new for all of us. Apart from that, it created a sense of innovation within the organization. The fact that it's possible, and that it attracted a lot of media attention when we presented the outcome of this project and presented the retrieved data on the projected on the sales of the Opera House. There was something magical in it, and what we also saw is that the media completely understood the message, because, for example, what they wrote in the newspapers was based on that video that we saw on DNA. Cathy Freeman's race, she will run forever. And that's the whole concept of it. And the fact that media understood this message means that it's a concept that speaks to the imagination, but also to sort of a realistic future. That's what we learned as well. And the very pragmatic outcome. This for us is the solution for the future, and that's what we want to work on. And in order to help to create a viable solution in terms of money, time, and resources.
Did you have any communication with Cathy Freeman? Does she know that what was her response to it?
She loved it. She didn't want to be part of the project itself. She endorsed it. She tweeted on the day on the night that we projected the race with this retrieved data on the sales of the Opera House, and loved the idea. So yeah, she's aware of it.
Yeah. Somebody else has asked that obviously DNA storage is a very futuristic concept. Are there other plans that the National Film and Sound Archive has up its sleeves to stay really on the cutting edge of this archival technologies?
Another thing we're working on with RMIT, the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology in Melbourne, is a concept called blockchain, which is actually digitally fingerprinting parts of your collection in order to track and trace, literally. So actually what you do is every file gets a digital fingerprint, which allows you to see in any type of use or reuse of that specific part of your content, how it's been used, by whom, if it's changed, what happens when it's brought back. So the file is used outside of the digital storage, is brought back. Is it still the same object again? Because that's crucial in order to be a trustworthy repository, because that's what we need to be as an archive. So blockchain helps us to trace the material and to be able to see if things have changed or not, to be able to say this is the trusted file, it's still the original, even when it's been digitized and used and reused thousands of times, it's still that same file that we want stored. And that's an important proof for an archive to be able to say we are trustworthy, which we need to be. So blockchain is one of the things we're working on, and who knows what else, what's now science fiction may help us to define our own future.
Actually, one question, what are the intellectual property I guess arrangements, for lack of a better word, with this? Because you're encoding something on a synthetically created DNA that's, the material that's being encoded is being created by someone that obviously has copyrights over that, or if they're still alive. And are there issues around managing the intellectual property situation?
No, you would say because it's a new situation, and again, this will last thousands of years. It doesn't mean that it changes the whole copyright background of that specific file, which is still based on the current copyright laws. That doesn't change. Again, it's just replacing the traditional storage solutions, storage systems, but all the other things are still the same. The copyright situation is still the same. The one who created is still the one who created. The difference is that his great-grandchildren will be able to retrieve it one day, and that wouldn't happen when it would have been stored on a tape or even on a film. But the rest is, everything is unchanged, is still the same. The whole workflow is still the same process as what we used before. It's just the end result that changes and that differs. But it doesn't change anything like that.
A question has been asked about the environmental impacts. You've obviously talked about the fact that reduced energy requirements because you won't be storing so much data and so much material. Has there been any modelling or any kind of attempt to estimate the impact that will have in terms of, for example, electricity consumption, but also perhaps greenhouse gas emissions?
No, not yet, not that I know. Probably there are some tests and pilots going on at this moment, because it is one of the most important topics of this solution. For us, it's rather easy to calculate what we would save if we don't have to pay for electricity anymore, at least not for this system or for the cooling systems and so on. And space, square meters, of course. But it will be part of the next step of this development, I'm sure.
There's a quite technical question that's come through on Twitter, which is sort of more a biological science question, but we'll ask it anyway. I'm talking about viruses and whether, because viruses can, I guess, take advantage of host DNA, and the question is, does virus control need to be considered, I guess, in the same way that you might need to consider, insect invasions of paper archive? Is that going to be one of the threats of the future, is actually, I guess, a different form of biological threat to these stored material?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's more important that the labs where these things are created are clean and free from viruses and so on, which is already the case because it's done in a lab environment. So that's one of the preconditions, one of the, literally in this case, hygiene factors for producing that DNA. So that's virus free, 99.99% obviously. As long as it's stored in this file, in files like this, it's safe. You can't touch it. The viruses can enter this unless you open it. So that again, everything that happens in the lab environment should be virus-free, and is virus-free. Potentially, of course, you could infect your collection with a virus, but it needs a lot of technology and maybe even terrorist approach to to be able to do that. And I don't think it will go that far.
Absolutely. Well, look, thank you so much to everybody who's asked a question today. And Jan Muller, thank you so much for your time talking about this extraordinary topic. Look forward to seeing where it goes in the next decade.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.